Hi, everyone. Today I'm joined by Jill Nephew, who was referred to me by Daniel Thorson, actually, when I went up and visited the monastic academy. Um, Daniel told me, Jill, about your work and mentioned that your sort of long-term vision was about having a retreat center where you do sense making. And since I've gotten to talk to you a bit more, I know that you're involved in sort of using software or certain kinds of tools, technologies to aid in sense making. And so you've been a member of our Metamodern spirituality group for a bit, and I'll be totally honest. Like I don't fully have a grasp of the work that you're up to. So I'm really hoping that we can. We've been talking about it for a little bit here and there, and I'll get little glimpses of it, but it's still largely opaque. So this is sort of an opportunity, at least for me, to learn more about what you're doing. And I hope you'll bear with me in asking what may seem like really remedial questions. But anyway, thanks for joining me, and let's just hop into it. So anything to add to any of that, or anything else about where you're coming to this from that you want to throw into the mix?
Yeah, I totally expect that to be the case with anybody I talk with. And we're kind of right out the gate. Like, we've been hiding and working our butts off for the last 12 years, just building, testing, iterating with the technology. And we're finally ready to start talking. So I'm finding my words through dialogue and through meeting other minds. So this is great. I really appreciate having the opportunity. And this might be rough. We'll see. Maybe it won't be rough. It'd be great if it's not rough. And also, we came at this from a very different direction. I think that is, we expect it to be hard to kind of map, but fun to map.
So how about you start out with just trying to explain a little bit what this is? I believe it's called Inqwire, right? And other than that, just kind of explain what it is, how it works, and what the kind of what it aims to do.
Okay, well, so Inquire is the business entity that holds the technology,
Gotcha.
but it's a mirror of a larger theory, which is what we really want to come forth with and talk to people about. So if Inquire were to like not exist anymore, I still want to be talking about the ideas behind Inquire. And the ideas behind Inquire are in partnership to Inquire because there's so much learning by doing. So we kind of say by analogy, we're really wrenching on the system is how we spend a lot of our time. It's like the Wright brothers, the time of the Wright brothers, there was the people that were really trying to figure out the theory of flight, and there's the bicycle mechanics that were kind of wrenching on things and learning by doing. So that's why often the tone I bring to presenting this stuff has a different flavor, because I will also be referring to things I learned through Inquire, but then feeding back on my larger understanding of the theory that Inquire started from. So it's kind of a little bit like that.
Gotcha. Well, how about give me the elevator pitch, but
Yeah.
presuming that we're sort of like the elevator gets broken and we have about 45 minutes. So start from like the basic elevator pitch and then kind of walk me through it.
How about we stop the elevator? Like, it's a really at least stop the elevator at a reasonable height every now and again and see how we're doing.
Right.
So stepping way back, I quit my job 12 years ago to try to address an intuitive sense of wanting to address what was now identified as meaning or wisdom crisis. I was identifying more about wisdom with technology. Seeing the problem, being very aware of the problem, having a felt sense of the problem through my own practices, and which I'm sure we can get into later, but my own direct experiences searching for something. I was searching for something, and I realized what I was searching for is what might be called wisdom. And also now I'd reframe that and say what I was searching for is what I would call a natural intelligence. So there's been a kind of evolution of the abstractions, and you caught it at sense making. And we actually, I guess I could speak to that quickly. We pivoted off sense making for a very specific reason and decided to reframe everything, which is a bit of work, into natural intelligence as a better criteria. So basically, let's just say, I'll finish up a little bit of the methodology. I'm sure we can get into that later, but I quit my job. I was already a technologist. I was already working on really big systems, and I was really working on big AI systems. So I was working on systems to help people work on hairy, wicked problems. So that was my first job out of college in 97, 98, was to work on an algorithms team and kind of be steeped in this problem of, should a computer think for you, or should a computer help you think? And how should a computer help you think about things that are real in the world, in the real world? And I got fascinated with that interface problem. So that was in the back of my mind: tools, technologies, democratizing everything, and what should that interface look like that helps us think better in the real world. And so bringing that intuition merged with my spiritual practice, traditional training, which is Gurdjieff. I'm sure someday maybe we'll get into that. A lot of intuition from those practices because of their embeddedness in the real world, their groundedness, they're very, very grounded practices. And then bringing to it also my science background. So it's kind of like a lot of things got folded into. And my science background was physics first, dealing with a lot of emergence and complexity is what I published papers in, and then moving on to do biophysics, wanting to do cellular biophysics. It didn't really exist in the 90s. It does now. So it's like an alternate life. I'd love to study it now, not in the 90s. And then going on to climate science and earth science and graduate work, so turbulence and atmospheric science. So I also bring different scientific background intuitions to the project. So that's kind of, that's kind of what I'm bringing to it that makes it very meta, but not coming from the same origins of this community. So it's everyone's been really patient, but I often just come in and just totally left field with this very different intuition, very different way of trying to formulate things and trying to, but I feel like the spirit is shared, that we all are just open and sharing. And, so I think.
Yeah. And that was a big kind of desire to do this sort of Zoom context, because you'll often bring a whole, angle into the mix where I'm like, I don't really know what the thrust of the argument is there. And so I feel like it can be very hard in like a Facebook or like an online forum context to get into some of that. So I think hopefully in this context, we can unpack a bit more. So anyway, sorry, keep going.
No, that's exactly right. Yeah. And I don't think we're going to get to, there's no way we're going to get to everything in this conversation. So hopefully we'll get to a dancing layer where we can just have fun. And we have a huge menu, I feel like, of things we could explore, and let's just see what we get pulled into. But yeah, the end of the kind of big picture pitch, which I think is worth doing, is so we pivoted away from sense making because of this problem, and this is what Ian McGilchrist really nicely put together, that there is a mindset where you confabulate, where you think something, you're thoroughly convinced that you're right about something and you have no idea, you can't even tell there's any problems. And so I don't think that the sense-making community has grappled sufficiently with how do we make that distinction between confabulation and a deeper knowing, which represent reality. So I don't think the term makes that distinction, but natural intelligence does. And so maybe I think if there's one thing I want to convey and try to popularize, if I had to choose my menu of what would I love to popularize and convey across podcasts anywhere, is try to get in front of the term natural intelligence and have it properly framed, hopefully, so they can hold up and be the right pointer. So maybe I'll just talk about.
Jump into, explain what do you mean by that term?
Yeah, so natural intelligence is a great term because it already exists in the literature. Sense making kind of didn't. If you looked in the literature of like how are academics using it, wasn't really there. But natural intelligence already has a place, and it exists in the AI literature, which is basically, it's a target. It's basically, how do you know you sufficiently created artificial intelligence? You would put a thing you've created in the real world, and it will survive and reproduce, and it will live. So, that's the ultimate criteria, is operational. And that's unsolved problem, obviously, and a hard problem, but we solve it. Living systems already solve it. So the reason I liked this term is that we could argue that right now, collectively, we stop solving it. Like, we know that we are doing things that are not against our survival, and yet our intelligence is not somehow aligned with being able to react to that, adapt to that. And we may not be able to, but at least we know, if we don't talk about what the goal state is, I thought it was a very nice goal state, then we don't know how to get there. And if you think about what that goal state represents, everything gets folded in. Like, we won't thrive if we don't have a spiritual self. We won't thrive if we don't have a eros. We won't thrive if we don't have, we need to reproduce. We need to fall in love. We need to do all these things. Natural intelligence, even though it sounds like an intellectual term, everything folds into it because it's all inclusive of living systems.
Okay, that makes sense. And I assume that Did that term predate artificial intelligence, or does it sort of come out of the artificial intelligence project in the literature there to sort of say that the kind of ideal aim of an artificial intelligence would be basically natural intelligence, in which case it's not artificial?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know the answer to that. I have to
Yeah.
ask artificial intelligence person. I just know that the community of practice splits. So people are working on creatures, which is really fascinating, where they try to build artificial creatures and see, can this thing figure out its environment? And then what happens to its artificial brain? And this comes into some of the complexity arguments I've pointed at. That's a very different trajectory than what's happening with like artificial neural nets, which aren't embedded, you know? So it's kind of like an argument that, are you studying artificial intelligence where it has a sensory network that's embedded in reality, such that you'd say, well, this thing participates in reality and has to respond to reality, and its cognition is extended into reality as kind of the starting conditions? Or are you kind of trying to say, no, I'm just going to define what's everything in the skull is cognition? It's kind of like, where do you draw your boundary and say that's sufficient?
Right.
So if you look up like all the different definitions of intelligence, there are many. Yeah. And they don't always. Yeah.
And it seems like this would dovetail a little bit with like John Vervaeke's work and 4E cognitive science, in the sense of, it's got to be embodied and embedded, not just kind of,
we very much take that frame that like we argue that Inqwire, it doesn't carry any baggage as an independent benefit corporation framed only by being consistent with natural intelligence and creating a world that makes sense. That's such a big container that we can kind of keep up. Like, we're just a technology trying to keep up with modern cognitive science. We're not beholden to any historic practices or anything like that. So exactly, we'd be very consistent with the 4E latest greatest.
So the sense that I get here is that, if the goal is, if you're engaged in sense making, meaning making, or as you're calling it, the kind of aim is this natural intelligence, you're sort of, if I understand you correctly, defining like success being specifically, well, can you kind of operate and maintain yourself and sustain yourself in existence basically as a living organism? And if you can do that, then pragmatically speaking, you've probably gotten something more or less right, because there's a correspondence between yourself and your environment that suggests that there's kind of that there's kind of a match between your kind of internal simulation of reality and whatever it is that reality is something like that.
Yeah, that's a great question and a great frame. So how do we know when we're getting hotter or colder? Before I would say in our last frame, I'd say, well, we have a sense when things make sense and add up, but then we had to say a little bit more than that. The road towards like a truthiness or away from a falsiness is a felt sense of insight that's pretty reliable. So there's certain cognitive senses we have that tell us we're getting hotter or colder. And so we have identified, found really useful, we independently identified what felt like the right metrics of like life outlook or liveliness. That would be our internal compass. So we have to get down to the root level. We have to get down to pre-verbal, even perceptual, potentially, maybe even like non-conscious layers, and understand how this organism bubbles up that, because that's what we'd expect natural intelligence to do. So it needs to dial in. So what are the senses we supposedly already came with the hardware that are telling us don't eat that plant, or form a relationship with this person, or this doesn't feel right, get out of here. So like something's not right, something doesn't add up. All those are senses. So it's identifying what would be the senses we'd expect that we're going to start working with that tell us how aligned we are with our natural intelligence versus the alternative.
How do you make a meaningful distinction or parse out the difference between that and that confabulation that you were just talking about then?
Yeah, it's really interesting. All kinds of ways. So we have a whole, we have a whole full course in the software where we teach about all this. This is like a teaching the metacognitive skills. So basically you don't have to make much of a distinction, because as Ian McGilchrist points out, when you are caught in the machinery of confabulation, when that part of your mind is active, not immediately, but eventually you'll start to not thrive. Like, you may or may not notice the signal, you have to dial into the signal. It's a little bit like waking up from a dream. I think it's very similar to that, where like, it's not hard to identify you're in a dream if you remember to check. So it's not hard to tell you're confabulating. The hard part is remembering to check, because by definition, your attention is captured when you're in the
Yeah.
state of confabulation.
That's
So it's
interesting.
yeah.
So a couple questions about that though, because
Yeah.
this is good, and I think we're kind of laying some foundation here that we can build on. But some
Mhm.
questions at this level, it'd be you know, Nietzsche had these ideas about how he sort of interrogates the quest for truth itself, and
Mhm.
he is able to kind of make a distinction between what is life affirming and
Mhm.
what is true,
Mhm.
and those might actually be different things.
Right.
Where it almost seems like what you're saying is that they are, or at least an element of them, isn't like the same thing, intrinsically linked. That if you are getting at the truth, you're also then going to be getting at what is kind of life affirming of. And when I say life affirming, I just mean supports
Yeah.
the organism and sustains it, that sort of a thing.
Well,
Yeah,
let's unpack that for a second. I have a
sure.
real answer for that. So when you say something's true, right, that's a closed statement. You need to satisfy all the constraints to say something's true. You need to like decide. So I don't know if that makes sense, but like that's a
Mm,
determination to decide. You have to decide if something's true or false. Like if you decide something's true, it has to be an argument that's complete. And so in a sense, science never admits truth. It admits that it's getting closer to it. But it can admit false. So in a sense, if we get away from the logical part of that statement, the felt sense of when you are pursuing truth would be a different mindset than when you're pursuing what's lively. But when you're pursuing what's lively, it's paved by insight, and insight reveals what was false. So it's like almost like insight is a deconstruction of a previous formulation that was part of the analytic framework that's concerned with what's true. But there's a recognition of that collapse. And then when you're back to lively, that whole framework disappears, because we're ultimately arriving at a quiet, empty connection, like complete embodied connection with what's happening, right?
well, maybe let me clarify and just make sure that we're using some similar terms here,
Okay.
not
Yeah.
equivocating. So like
Mhm.
so when I use the word like truth, I'm meaning it in this sense to be, let's say that there's this hypothetical thing called truth, and it is what one is engaging with or somehow intuiting when one is sort of correctly doing the sense making, when one is correctly mapping one's
Mhm.
interior simulation to the exterior environment, that sort of a
Mhm.
thing, which is, it's like if I see the bear and I'm able to run away from the bear, I will live. And my ability to see that bear and affirm its reality
Yeah.
is what is sustaining me, helping to sustain my living organism, etc. If I lacked the ability to see something that was there that could take me out, that
Right.
would be, yeah, all that.
So
So then
clear seeing, maybe. Do you like clear seeing? I like clear
yeah, well,
seeing.
I'm up to use any terminology you want. I just yeah, so we can steer clear of truth if that means more in the way that you use it, maybe something more logical. But I was just trying to use the word truth to suggest that, if I say there is a bear,
Right.
that means that thing, that sense making thing that we're
Exactly.
talking about.
Okay.
So
I'm
yeah.
happy to use any term. I see what we're agreeing to. So yeah, I'm saying that we've tried a lot of terms out. We try to be really precise with our language. So I really appreciate slowing down on these points. Definitely. I mean, I think this is how you really get somewhere, so this is great. So we often just use reality for that. And we say reality is that which would, like, if we're all describing the elephant, we don't have to see the same thing, but it's all going to add up. As we put together our own perceptions, they're going to synthesize together into a coherent whole. And it's going to be stable, and it's going to be explainable, and it's going to add up with our history. Everything's going to add up. So maybe when everything adds up, yeah, that's kind of how we're defining reality, and saying that we could converge to something where we all agree, like, to that. And that almost like disagreement is a breakdown of that. It's not a real thing.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
then you would say, maybe use the phrase like a clear seeing of reality rather
Mm,
than throwing out a loaded word like truth.
right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Um,
Because doesn't truth sound like you can transmit it,
I mean,
like communicate it?
this is the problem with words, is that they're
Yeah.
highly
Yeah.
associative and contextual and connotative and all these things. So yeah, I'm just trying to make sure that whatever terms that we use, we're not stumbling over the just the language of it all.
Mhm.
So okay. So then to reframe my question then, I'm I'm trying to think of how to express this in sort of that Nietzschean term, but like I think Nietzsche would
Mhm.
say that the clear seeing of reality in certain contexts might uh, might overwhelm an organism, let's say, and actually be deleterious to its well-being, or its you know,
Mm.
it would be not life affirming to kind of stare into that too much, right? So like I don't know, let's say like if someone just goes through an extreme disaster and incredibly traumatic thing, which is just they that their mind, let's say, represses it, or they get into some
Right.
denial state about it, and by doing that they are able to keep going.
Mhm.
Now there you seem to have sort of a potential breakdown between this notion of clear
Right.
seeing of reality and the longevity of the organism. And so how would you kind of factor that into this?
There's so much good stuff in there for which well, we could talk all day. So yes, I would say that the clear seeing of reality is a real-time operation, like just like your eyeballs. So the fact that you maybe feel like you have this model where you didn't process the past somehow make sense of it. Uh, if it's not salient in a sense, it wouldn't matter. If it is salient, it would be bothering you. And so what we have we have a model where we say that the organism's design, this is kind of paralleling Jung's idea. I'm no Jung expert, but I read a quote that seemed aligned, which is this idea that, you know, when the mind's ready, it presents to you what it wants to make sense of, and mainly because things bother you. And so this is consistent with the latest greatest resilience research, which is basically looking at the unevenness where people will go through extreme trauma and seem to be fine, and other people aren't fine. And the explanation is kind of a sociological model. Like, you went through a big trauma, but where did you land? If you landed somewhere where you can still navigate life, like you still have your basic needs met and you know how to move forward in your life, that's when you don't feel it. If you land somewhere where and you feel safe from that thing, like if you can make sense make around it, in as much that you're protected from it, like all your mind needs is what's plausible. Like if I know something happened to me and by a person that I've compartmentalized correctly as being incentivized in some very rarefied way that would never happen again, and that person dies, do I need to go deeper to understand more about that to feel safe? Well, if I think that the conditions to create more of them all of a sudden arise, and all of a sudden I start feeling unsafe, and now I've got to go deeper. But so there's layers. Like, as things
Yeah.
bother us, we have to go deeper into what do we need to make sense of to navigate right now. We can't. It's not a. There's a lot of this stuff with like the healing where you could just heal forever, and it's like, well, you could go look under all the old rocks and stuff, but that's not really what the research would suggest. The research would suggest that, you know, your mind is presenting you with whatever you need to make sense of to move forward.
Yeah, and all that makes total sense at an individual level. To frame this in the context of what I'm interpreting
Yeah.
this project to be related to is, as you kind of said at the outset, that supposing that there is a reality that we're all kind of constitutively putting together ourselves, but that it is there, and that disagreements are essentially kind of a breakdown in our ability to kind of communicate and see that shared reality. The premise seems to me that we could get somewhere where, like, hypothetically, everyone's doing great sense making or natural intelligence,
Right.
and everyone just sees the world the way it is. But in these sorts of instances, right? Like, let's say my cousin is convinced that, and has had to convince herself that, like, her whole family did not die in a fire, but she was born an orphan. Like, that was a coping mechanism or something. Now, I could, in conversation with her, say, no, factually speaking, historically, this is what happened. And she would
Right.
disagree. And it's sort of like, at what point, who's seeing reality clearly in that context, right?
Okay. So basically the idea, first let me make sure I was clear about my last point, which is to say that if you do the model where you follow what's bothering you, then it'll never be worse than what's bothering you. Like, what Nietzsche, people stare into the abyss and go seeking out bothersome conundrums. lots of philosophers too. I've done it. And gotten really deep in, and of course, any deep spiritual seeker, dark night of the soul, you can really stumble into these deep, hard holes. And I don't have a definitive answer to this, but when I switched to a bothering framework, when I've been in those holes, it has bootstrapped me out. And this is something I've been talking to, Daniel Ingram's initiative of saying, we could test that, with the Inqwire technology. It's designed to say, let's switch frames. Instead of following the whatever is telling you to go deeper into a pain, let's step back and listen to the thing that says, what's bothering you about the existential vacuum? What bothers you about the idea of being a separate self? Like and all of a sudden there's this grounding that happens. So it's almost like yes, detrimental to your well-being if you aren't grounded in asking your being, what is it, if you stop listening to it, like what's bothering it right now? Like, yes, absolutely, you can get into situations that are detrimental to your well-being, and listening to what's bothering you is a way to is in theory a way to navigate towards your well-being. So yeah, I could see those being a split, absolutely. But why would you? So I'll tell a story. I'll come in sideways on your cousin story. That might blend a nice example. My brother, my half brother, he was raised separate from me. So I didn't see how this unfolded, but I got to know him as an adult. And his last psychotic break was in his 20s, and then late in life in his 50s. They put him on he got cancer, and they put him on a medication that he was delirious. And everybody was really concerned because he started interpreting these trees on the patio as being people who are going to give him a job. And half of the family is like, but that's not true. Those aren't people, those are trees. And if you listen to the literature of how do you work with people in that state, especially Finnish open dialogue, which I really admire their work. I just sat down with him and I tried to listen deeper than what was true or false for what's he really trying to express. So we talked about how hard it is to not work, and how hard it is to be, your job is to take drugs until you die, and how much he misses working. And we cried about that, and we talked about that. And then the message was transmitted, and that's how I interpret it. And that's how the open dialogue people would interpret it, is that he had created a simple system to communicate, he created something to communicate something, a reality. And once we got to what was underneath it, he just voluntarily said, that's funny, I had a dream last night that those trees are people who are going to give me a job, and now I know they're just trees, kind of thing, basically. Like, yeah, that's weird. I thought trees were people. It's just like ordinary, like he woke up from a dream kind of thing. Mm-hmm. So I think in terms of where are we coming from when we want to disabuse other people of our truth versus their truth, understanding that, was that a coping mechanism or deeper? So the story of your cousin, is your perception of what's real helpful because in a sense your job of helping is to get someone else's world? And so if you actually do that in earnest, you may realize that people can even be aware, there could be an agreement at a deeper level that makes what appears to be a disagreement on the surface irrelevant. So there could be a shift that happens, because it's like the analytic mind has no choice but to confabulate. So, and I left this as kind of mystery in the series. So if people want to, we record this podcast series, I left it as a mystery, but at what layer do we start disagreeing? And one could say, once you're building mental models at all, they're all going to disagree because they're not reality. So, if you want to do models against model, if that's the layer you want to be at, then, which one's true? Neither. Like you might say, well, it's a fact, she's adopted or not. It's like, but is that really the important truth of it? Right. Yeah.
So then as I'm understanding, like Inqwire and the work that you're doing around natural intelligence, it would be superficial to think of it purely as just, do we all agree about like fact claims about reality? It's much deeper than that. And that at a deeper level, we might be able to share a clear seeing of reality. Is that true? And if so, is it the case that like at surface levels, people could still continue very much to disagree about things, but they would generally just be kind of surface model disagreements and not kind of deeper disagreements? Is that what you're saying or suggesting?
Yeah, I think we're saying that if you were well versed in this and operating and understood the stack, which we haven't talked about yet, then we might start languaging around that of like, here's my model, here's your model.
Yeah.
Okay, that they're both plausible. Models only have to be plausible, and then we both know we're coming from different data. So it's like, do you want to do the cognitive work to sync them up or not? It's a lot of cognitive work to sync up models. So generally, you want to do that around arriving at a shared goal state. Then you have to start to figure out like how much work do you want to do, but you certainly recognize there's no point in trying to arrive at a true model because there is no such thing.
Gotcha.
All that's true is the grounding into reality, like we talked about, and that's open.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So take us a little bit deeper then. And you mentioned the stack. I don't know what the next good thing would be to get into, but say more about how this is, what it is, how it works, that sort of thing.
Yeah. I came up with this morning, so this is all real time. How do I explain this? So I think that it's important. I think we're pointing at the stack, what I'm calling the stack, and I want to talk about the stack. I've heard other people talk about the stack. I think who have I heard? That's oh my gosh, Michael Taft. Michael Taft. I think I got it from him, talking about going from the intellectual analytic to the perceptual down to the, and then underneath, going down the whole stack in meditation where they go into deeper into the cognitive system and then come back out and they can kind of start to look at the stack. So I'm gonna walk the stack a little bit in my own way and say that that what do we have going on? So first off, let's see, how should I approach this? Our argument, we've been talking about models, and so there's a layer of the stack where models exist. So there's a thing, that's what we articulate, and we do it all the time. Languaging creates the models and learning mechanisms, and we're living in a model, we're interacting with a model, that whole argument. So to access that model, right? If I wanted to give that model to myself or give that model to you, I use a certain kind of languaging around that. And we can say that so far, models, we seem to be able to, just about everything we can conceptualize, it seems like we can put into words, like we can somehow do more than just give the model. So now we're getting to a deeper level where I'm actually arguing that I'm running a simulation in your brain. Like I'm using language as a simulation language. So natural language, and I think a lot of people don't appreciate this. This is a real eye opener to me. Like I was like, oh, this adds up. This makes so much sense. So we often think of language as a pointer to things. But if we look at how it's actually used, 95% conversationally is like the first 1,000 words roughly, and written it's like 85%. So there's this whole set of language which are called closed class words, which are the parts of language that are, they're basically doing the simulation. They're doing all the situated cognitive work. Cool. So probably everyone listening knows what I'm talking about here. So it's like running a simulation. We know about the situated conceptualization of everything's relativistic in this framework, and it might even go out informed by a physics engine-y thing, and which we don't talk about enough, also informed by our affective landscape, and so on. So basically we've got this whole, it's the whole metaphor idea. So we're 95% of what I'm doing is just to run a simulation in your brain. And then periodically I come in with the open class word, which is some word I've made up that I talk around, and we eventually say that's the word. So the metonymization process. So we're saying that basically that's one part of what's happening with language. And then as I'm running a simulation in your mind, I am using language to point at the things you can bring into your conceptual, workspace, mental workspace, however, there's lots of words for it, but basically what you can imagine and introspect. And then that's how you're actually able to start to synthesize this really powerful higher level cognition, which is the conceptual blends. So if you look at, we make this argument really thoroughly, but Judea Pearl, who I've pointed at many times to you, has made this argument as formally as I've seen.
I bought the
Yeah,
book,
that's
the
the
book
first
of
step.
why.
It's really dry. It's really dry. All my books are really dry, unfortunately. But he does this great. He does like the least dry version of this argument I found, which is to really clearly point out that the analytic intelligence that we're all actually steeped in is not nearly as powerful as this. What we can do with this blending, running simulations and doing thought experiments, counterfactual imagining, but grounded imagining. So it's not fantasy. It's like, all future thinking is like kind of grounded imagining. So there's lots of reasons to believe that we can trust that as being very able to get really close to reality, because that's what science does. So that's what he kind of points out, is like, we've given science all the credit. Like, scientists go out and very analytic and very rational, measure things, and then they do math and here's the model. But really what they're doing is they're just imagining wildly, doing counterfactual and saying, I have an idea. I'm going to go see if I can test it. So the heavy lifting is this higher level cognition. So if you say basically, how do you, how do you simulate in other people's mind? We're saying this is how I'd simulate something I know in your mind. And then there's another layer of the stack, which is, how do I ask you to share your simulation? Like, how do I ask you to give me the simulation? And that's inquiry. And how to ask myself to give myself a simulation. And so if you look at software, the language you use at the inquiry model, it can be very different than the language you use, database inquiry language model. It can be very different than the code that's running the simulation. So Inqwire, the kind of the interesting part of Inqwire was that I, started the project saying I need really good inquiry, because what I want to do is draw out tacit knowledge. I want to draw out wisdom from people somehow and figure out how to share it. I want a shared wisdom framework, was the first imagining. So I need to be able to draw out things from people that I know is a simulation. It's not their thinking, it's that they know from direct experience, meaning it's introspectively available, meaning it's like a tacit knowledge lived thing. So what is the form of that? And then what happened from that study was to realize that that language is very small and there's not that many forms. If you by virtue of I just basically started pulling resources ever I could find of every inquiry example I could find, and no one had actually done this study before. It's a really understudied area, inquiry, and just looked at what are the forms, the language forms people use for inquiry. So Inqwire was basically about modeling those forms and working with those forms, and so and so pulling in. Oh, go ahead.
Well, I want to try to make sure that we're on the same page still. So I want to try to unpack some of the stuff you just said. So real quick, you mentioned the stack, but could you just summarize that again for me so I know what you are referring to? Or maybe you mentioned it, but you only touched on part of it. I got that there is sort of a cognitive element, but yeah, sorry. Yeah.
No, I guess I was wanting to point out a blend of kind of how does language, because Inqwire is a language system, interact with the stack and start to paint a picture so I could start to make an argument of what actually Inqwire does and why it's more than just an analytic framework. So people would often think with language, if you think about language pointing at things, like we started out with, this like apple, orange, bottle, that how causal, right? We're in this layer that analytic intelligence knows, countable, labeled, categoric, pointing, like that is the languaging of the analytic intelligence. That's the model layer. And so I'm saying that some people would think that Inqwire is operating at that layer, meaning that when you engage in it, it'll be analytic. It'll feel like what's true. It won't feel like clear seeing, insight.
I see.
Or, the main experience we'll have in Inqwire is a lot of crying.
So it's not, oh yes, of course, 2 + 2 = 4.
No, it's like, oh, I see how I've not been an enemy to myself. I see it.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Right. And so just when you're mentioning or referencing the stack, you're referring to, yes, we kind of have this cognitive mental headspace, but the kind of clear reality the seeing that you're referring to is deeper down as well. It's more affective and intuitive and emotional. Okay, right. So the stack's just
completely embodied.
Gotcha. Yeah. Okay. And
that language steers that. So you can see that. I think I pointed that earlier. Like you can see one of the first clues I got was that open-ended question and solitude opens up the wisdom, so you can access the tacit knowledge layer. And then in the building of the system, when I was trying to go for what was introspectively available as the tuning, as the metric for the questions, you can feel when you're getting closer to the right question form, the inquiry layer versus the analytic layer. If you're noting yourself, using yourself as a lab, you can feel when you're getting closer, because you'll notice eyes up, shoulders down, breath deepens. You can feel that movement. You can just like feel like close, and the languaging will tune that, and that's measured. You can change one word and move people from one to the other. So really the Inqwire project, it was very much about the heavy lifting was sitting around trying to tune language forms around inquiry to try to come up with a universal general model and go into all the ways of looking that would open up had the potential of, and in our measure was insight and life outlook.
So then, okay, so that's helpful, and it's helping orient me a little bit more towards understanding, what this is and what it isn't, I think. So could you say a bit more then about how it actually works, and like what it looks like to do this?
Yeah. So what was really interesting that came out of this study, first off, that I ran out of question forms, as I said, like they were converging, like it was definitely going to converge. There might still be some missing, but it was obvious as I was doing the study for a year and a half that like I was running out of forms. I started seeing that these are repeat. And then as I did the modeling of what generally a question is a connector, right? It's pointing from to, and that was a lot of them. So like the pure open-ended ones, like how does that feel? Or tell me about that. There's the classic, mere Rogerian therapy ones, or you just, are kind of one layer. But then if you get to like the Terry Gross, like, that's a great question, Terry. Like, well, I never thought about that. Those ones tend to connect things up between categories. And then you can kind of start to shape this ontology. And what the insight was, the way I shaped the ontology is, I think I've talked to my math friend about this. I think it's called homology modeling, but maybe someone else listening can tell me exactly what it is. But it was looking at the topology of, because every question form connects two categories, when you're on a category, I can test if that category is complete, if it has all the same connections. So does this thing belong in the same category if it connects the same way to every other category? Of course, there's this huge interdependence going on. So it would take a lot of reflection and tuning through hundreds of versions of the model, trying to like slowly have it converge. And then what came out of that was to realize that this kind of makes sense because I can argue it from a physics perspective. I can see like an amoeba would choose these 12 categories to live. And I did amoeba as like a test case. Like these are life dimensions. And that's just what came out of the open-ended question forms.
This is very cool. This is very cool. And I think, again, I'm starting to understand this a bit better. I'm not sure if have you ever heard of the Corey David Barker and any of the stuff he's doing around archdisciplinarity and simulation modeling and stuff? It wasn't until I started, hearing what he was about that I could begin to have that this is starting to make a bit more sense, if that makes sense, because it's like cool.
Awesome.
Yeah, there's sort of it seems like you're dealing with some almost primordial concepts that any living organism is going to have to navigate successfully, and that yeah, okay. Yeah. So it's almost kind of okay. Now
so now you're getting it. That's the stack. So the stack, you're at the stack when all of a sudden you go to the silent layer. Like the insights aren't verbal. The understanding is not verbal. It's horizontal. Insights are always outside the system. That's why analytic intelligence fails. So when you get to the question inside the system, it's almost like, some people might think if you're building a model in Inqwire, people say, oh, how do you not get caught in the ruminative loops in a closed model? And the way I try to think about it is like, think of it as a model of windows instead of a model of, like it's a model where you get to look out the windows everywhere. There's endless invitations to escape the maze. You're already in the maze. If you created a model, you're already in it. Is your model open? Does it open out? And that's something we point out a lot in I don't want to get off. Someday maybe we'll get to this, maybe in this conversation, but basically that like you can create analytic frameworks, particularly statistical models or AI models, but especially statistical models that can't be grounded. And if you create a model out of something that can't be grounded, you can really get trapped. And we have a lot of those in our culture, a ton of those. Yeah. So this is a big push. We haven't recorded that episode yet, but we really want to, I'd really love to get out there more if I, beyond Inqwire and just advise tech companies of like, you have a moral obligation to examine this work. This is very much the work of Gerd Gigerenzer, who is a rationalist, very, very well known in the bounded rationality community. But he originally back in the 90s showed how you could switch forms from different statistical forms and go from people not being able to think in nonsense to being able to come up with reasonable answers. And now he's on about ecological rationality, which is very similar to, I think, what we're talking about in spirit. Yeah.
Could you say what you mentioned, like 12 questions that might kind of like even that the amoeba could.
12 dimensions. Yeah. 12 dimensions.
Yeah. So I'd love to start. I mean, what really helps me often is like either lists or sort of visualizations, maps of some kind, whether actually
and I think I shouldn't call them dimensions because they're not measures, but I think of them as like directions of looking. So in that way I use them as dimensions, but I don't think they have like a they don't have a measure on them. So I haven't quite figured out the right, and they're not really a category, but they're going to be familiar to everybody. Probably people haven't even realized that if you counted all the ones that you're working with, that these would come out, but they came out of the language, the question study, which is interesting. So like, challenges, beliefs, social context, goals, mission, whatever, goal states, others, entities. I'm sorry, I'm not sure if I looped yet. I don't have it memorized. I should have it memorized, I think, at this point, but beliefs, behaviors, life chapters. And so I may have missed a few, but if we went through each of the kind of things people generally talk about in a big way, and you see a whole psychological frameworks of identity are built around this. So if you look at like belief challenging is a whole framework built around one of the categories, or the IFS stuff where you make everything into a part of yourself. So, okay, one of them is parts of self. I get them confused. There's family constellations. Yeah, family constellations, entity work. IFS would be working with everything as an identity / entity. Values work, Joe Edelman and whatnot. And that's really picking up a lot of steam, which is great. And I feel like there's a whole bunch to be done, which is just arising around social context. So that's the poor forgotten sociologists Daniel Thorson had this episode where like they're deep sociology, like we don't have a good word for the matrix. Like we have a silly word for it. We need a real word for it, So deep sociology, like staring down, like that social pressure we feel and what's going on with tribalism and everything else. So like each of these dimensions, and then personal truths is another one. And so that is like about our deepest knowing, like what we know from experience and working with that. So these are all modalities, but the question, but if you start to ask, how do they work together?
So
how do they interplay?
Question here. So I was trying to write some down, and it doesn't matter that if we have the full list here or anything, but just to get a sense of kind of the texture of these. So like a person or an amoeba is going to be considering or have some notion of personal truths, challenges, beliefs, social context, goals, others, entities, behaviors, life chapters, parts of self, family constellations. Okay,
that's right.
And these are.
So do you want me to do one for the amoeba?
Sure. Yeah.
I mean, like, so if you think about an amoeba level, social context is the question: what am I a part of? Like, what do I need to coordinate with for my survival? What am I coordinating with? I can't live without, so that comes and goes in slime mold, basically. Sometimes it doesn't need to coordinate, sometimes it does. But when it forms a meta-organism or whatever, when it comes together as an organism, all of a sudden the social context needs to be known. It needs to somehow have a sense of it and, to operate natural intelligence. Its beliefs are just its future models. Its personal truths might be that I know that when the sun hits me, I wither, and when I'm on a cold, damp log, I thrive. Its values could be whatever its chemoreceptors are set up for, what it feels like it needs to live, like just that direct, what does it value? Its goal state set up all the time as it comes and goes, as it migrates and moves, forms a slug or whatever, so that would arise out of like satisfying everything. It has a sense of itself. That's kind of interesting. It does have identity. That's been worked out. The slime mold knows the boundary of itself. It has a relationship to others. It eats, it hunts. I don't know if it can escape anything, but it definitely has to model its food. I don't know which one I left out, but you can kind of start to get a sense that there's challenges and barriers could just literally be like obstacles. Like I've got to get around this thing to get to the thing.
And is this how would I say, like a successful AI, or again, it's kind of funny, AI versus natural intelligence, but let's say you're building a machine and your goal is that it's going to be intelligent and it's going to, as you say, kind of live and sustain itself. It needs to have
model of this, right?
A model of all of these things. And it's interesting
somehow a cognitive model. Yeah.
It's interesting that and you're saying that there's sort of a finite number of these that we can actually say, it's just these 12. Like it could have more, but it really just needs these 12. Or
we're constrained. We go as deep as language. So I remember there's one episode I really like, Bonita Roy talking about layers of meta. I don't know if you caught that from a few years ago with Daniel Thorson, and like how many layers of meta are there? And I was like, well, at some point, I can only go as deep as language, natural language, and we don't extend our natural language. So those closed class words are things like the word the, a, it, and when, where, and so on. So we're not going to come up with another word for those things. And then we can, so in a way, if it's missing anything, well, we're screwed, because that's what we have to coordinate with. So let's see what we can do.
So another question here then. So is and let me know if I'm preempting things and there's other stuff that would be more important to get into before trying to answer this question. But like, is the way that this works and the reason why it's successful is it's like once you're able to essentially home in on these kind of fundamental categories or modes or modalities, whatever they are, then you're able to really be, it's sort of like, the phrase in philosophy is like you're trying to carve existence at its joints, right? And I feel like, and so joints. When in building meta models, that's sort of the idea, right? Like there's the desire, like in integral context, like, well, the quadrants kind of has it all. And if you're going to get everything involved, you kind of need all this stuff. And so it seems like, if I understand this right, that if you're going to be doing effective natural intelligencing, you kind of need to home in on these categories and then do the work to actually like understand how these things are operating in you. Otherwise, you might be kind of operating from a self-deceptive standpoint of like, maybe you don't really have a full understanding of your identity or your social contexts, and maybe that causes frictions and problems. And then when you start to understand these things, it leads to that kind of full-bodied insight. Is it something like that?
Yeah, that's great. I really like how this is going, by the way. This is really easy on me. It's so nice. You just pull it out of me. It's really hard to do the push model. It's like definitely
it's funny because like it takes this sort of a thing to be able to kind of unpack all this stuff. And so it's very hard to kind of deal with it piecemeal here and there. So like, I'm very interested and I want to try to get it in my head so I understand.
No, it's great.
But anyway, anywhere you want to go with any of that.
Yeah. So I'd say like we never have a complete understanding. We just have a sufficient understanding to get us plausible enough to get us to the next step, because life just keeps coming at us, so there's no completeness in life. And what do we notice? We notice when it breaks down. We notice when it doesn't serve us, when our models stop serving us, we're bothered. We notice the dissonance, and we would naturally feel a transition from fear to curiosity as we grapple with it. That eventually we get curious to resolve the dissonance, and then the fear might be, run away from what you don't understand first and then sneak up on it. So we try to definitely respect that those instincts are right, and that's one thing, again, to reiterate, like there's so many great instincts in our mind because obviously we came with them. We came with all the machinery to do this. We just forgot it, and we can talk about how we forgot it, which is also interesting. But the idea is that well, first off, maybe one way to think about this is that what problem we're really trying to solve. Like we're saying, you should just naturally be able to do this. why do you need technology? And the reason we're suggesting we need technology is that we have organized around static analytic models that are fed from the energy source of petroleum and creating this waste that's poisoning our life support system and ourselves. Like the system we're operating in for our survival isn't right. We're not thriving in it. We're living barely, but we're on borrowed time. So if that weren't the case, there'd be no need. So it's really trying to adapt to this problem we created for ourselves, where we have a lot of people here that we care about, and we want to transition as many as possible to something better as these systems start collapsing. And the systems are tied to models, and the models, hurt. So the idea is that what's happening is that our attention's being trapped in all kinds of ways that we may be noticing or may not be noticing it. Our models do not work in reality without the system, but they work in the system. So this is going to be a really unstable time. Like all I have to do is wake up, go to my job, do what they tell me to do, get my paycheck, make my house payment. My kids will be fine. Everything will be fine. Like I just follow those rules, and that's my model, and that worked. And now that's working less and less in fewer and fewer places, and life's is starting to encroach. And so we're going to have to switch. Right. So the idea is to rapid model updating, rapid model interrogating. And so first it's basically, so in the doing of Inqwire, it's to go meta and understand and start to articulate and understand what is the model you're operating with. And that can and so we have a natural language processor that'll break down writing into what those categories are. And it's getting there, it's kind of cool because again, like because we're dealing with this, we don't need all the language, so if you ask like now, what does it take to look at the combinations of the closed class words that point at the categories, that kind of carve out the model? How do we carve out the model? If you look at that, that's tractable. It turns out it appears to be tractable. So I was able to write a explainable algorithm that could do that. And it's not growing exponentially, it's converging. So, it's not 100%, but it's close. It's like, 80% maybe.
Well, quick question. Just for clarity here. So you're saying that like maybe something that might happen would be there's a question that and I'd like to know a little bit more how the questions are framed too, but like I'm asked a question, I might write a page or two response, and then the technology is able oh, okay, well, or some response, and the technology is able to basically say, your world system is based on these like 5 categories or something like that. Is it?
It would put your writing into the categories. So basically, like it would take clauses you're saying when you point at things. You use metonymization to point at things, and so we're looking at all the things that point at things to say this is what it looks like. You pointed at caring about this. You pointed at this relationship being significant. You pointed at this is your belief. You pointed at this is what you value. And so I built a natural language processor to do that operation, so people can kind of X-ray their own writing and see that. It's helpful, but it's not essential. You can do it for yourself too, and people do it for each other when they mirror. Like they will say, "I hear this," So we do it. So that was interesting. It's not using statistics. It's not using an AI in the traditional sense. It doesn't need data. It's a explainable, algorithmic system. It's a lot of algorithms, but it's coming together. So that was really cool because I wasn't sure if it'd work when I tried that approach, and it also surprised me that it worked. So that's one way you can interact with it. But generally, what happens is people learn the felt sense of the categories. They know something's bothering them. They can articulate. They have to do. We do train all the stack of psychotechnologies to get to be able to articulate what's bothering you. There's a lot you can do there. Like you can be really deeply bothered, and have to deal with all the emotions, and like you can be really psychologically distressed. So there's layers you sometimes have to go to and sit with until something is ripe and ready. But other times you just know exactly what it is. So once you get to the articulated layer, like this is what's bothering me, or at least a start. Now that's more likely where you start with like a sentence or a clause or something, and you can see how it breaks down. You can see what you're pointing at, and you can try out the categories. And then what usually happens is, you categorize it into one of the 12. And then as it turns out right now, to kind of all the ways of looking attached to a category is between about 25 and 45. And you can start working with the questions, the inquiries, and see if it's getting you there. Pretty quickly, you can start to say, oh, that's not quite the thing. So it's like depthy people are like, you know what, now that I'm working with it, I don't think that's quite the thing. I think it's really about this. So there's lots to support pivoting as things get revealed. There's often, you don't need to get very deep in, because often all of the layer to do this meta work gets you into not the first person perspective, but the objective above it all perspective. And that often just that shift is enough. And your mind will want to stop when it's enough. Like your mind doesn't want to do extra work. So at any point, you don't necessarily do all the lenses. You can, I have, and if you really, sometimes you want to just to be thorough because you feel like you should be thorough, but your mind's kind of like, I really got it with the first one. You'll know when you get it. So when you see the thing you didn't see, and then it makes it all add up, and you can and as soon as you feel like you see the way forward, you naturally just want to be like, okay, I'm good. I'm back on track. I want to get back to life. So that there's that. And then there's kind of this other, so that's one way. That's kind of like the day-to-day kind of way we leverage technology, is the idea that when you're when you're not feeling good and something's bothering you, you need to find a way of looking. You're missing some part of the model. You're missing something. And if you if you kind of, maybe it's an invitation to the audience, but if you kind of pay attention to what you're often doing, a lot of people have kind of their best hits or favorite inquiries they might do, or favorite frames or reframing. CBT is all about reframing. So they'll bring the kind of a repertoire to it. And we're saying that Inqwire just expands that repertoire. So you're more likely to find and look there are like different ways of looking, right? So you'll find the way to look. That's what I was missing, and you'll get it.
Yeah.
And so like, that's just you against your mind trying to find, using the way of looking to find that thing. But now there's this other crazy layer that this is why we're trying to recruit for community practice, which I think we'll get to later. But there's this other crazy layer, which I think we talked about in our first conversation, which is that if you start to take these dimensions and you start to build models with it, the system will bring back as a cue whatever you put in the model. So if you think about how does mind normally work, when you are looking around, your mind's associative by mood and by context. So you might see something because you never looked in that direction, but you also are in a kind of maze. Like you're going to see what you can see that's associative from that direction. If you build an artificial memory like this, where you curate your model, it can bootstrap you out of the maze, right? So you may feel lost, and this acts as a interesting layer to show you the dissonance, to bring you back to basically equanimity. So it's like real-time equanimity machine, which is kind of the engine of the spiritual evolution. It's like to try to return to equanimity as often as possible. So you get the context. Equanimity to me is just understanding the bigger context that the current experience is embedded in. So you can curate and decide how you want to represent that's meaningful to you, your own pointers, your own meaningful words in these categories, and you hold your own space to bring you back to what is your model.
Mm-hmm.
So we see the tool as being, very complementary to whatever dynamic model people are working with, as a way that they organically can do that. And they can also watch the model kind of dissolve, collapse, reconstitute itself, change, shift, break down, and which is also a really interesting meta process that if you don't go to trouble to articulating the model, you wouldn't really notice that evolution, which is kind of interesting.
Well, I have a couple more sort of, again, just kind of basic logistic questions here. So what's the interface exactly? What is this like? I mean, you're describing how the process might look, but like just, practically speaking, logistically speaking, how does one do this? I guess would be my first question.
Right. Like it's an app that you can use on desktop or from mobile. So I like to use it. Both me and my co-founder have converged to just like use it from our phone. It's always there, and you can be out in nature, and that's really great. So anywhere you have cell phone reception. So basically, like I said, you're doing this whole process, and you can think of it like unpacking. Like, what do you want to unpack? Something comes up, you really want to unpack it. I think that's a familiar felt sense thing, and so you kind of figure out the best way to articulate in the system, and then you get an inquiry process. And then what I often do is I would go off in nature or at home. I like walking and doing it, and just get to a question. Maybe I can sit if I want to sit, but often the questions some you might just want to sit with. Like there are things you can put into it where the nature of the question would be very open, and maybe even like it's a way of looking. So you could put in question forms that would almost feel like koans or feel like deeper reflections where you're just sitting with that way of looking. It may not have to be resolved. So it kind of goes all the way to like, it can be grounded into your direct experience where like, what do I want for dinner? Well, I don't know. Like, here's what we have in the, it can be, it can be really grounded into that, or it can be as open to where you're trying to connect with much larger abstractions or entities that you can't ground as easily into your concrete experience, and you need to feel into, such as, traditionally everything represented by spiritual layer, let's say, that like, the layer that isn't so salient, so tangibly salient.
This it makes me think of like the alethiometer, if you've ever seen.
It's very much, it reminds us of that too. And sorry, let me say, there's a reason for that. That's back to that. I do hope we do get to the arts of truth work, or at least
sure, we can go anywhere you want. I just it's helpful for me, and I think it'll be helpful for people watching this to have first kind of a clear sense of what it is and that sort of a thing. But
whenever we
well, so another question I was going to ask was that in terms of like using this, is it it sounds like it can be daily. It could be you go on. I know that the initial context in which this came up was of doing like retreats with something like this and kind of focusing on something like that. But it sounds like it's sort of forgive the analogy because it's obviously a lot more than this, but it's almost like a magic 8-ball. You can kind of be like, well, what do I do this? No. Then you can kind of like obviously then go through the process, but it kind of gives you some orientation. It seems like at any level, from the mundane to the sacred or something. Is that
that's right?
Yeah.
Well, I think, so a couple of dimensions to this. Yeah, that's right. So like basically you have a sense of what you want to unpack, right? Like, do you want to unpack death this morning before you go to work? No, you don't want to, like, no. So like we have a sense of like what we're signing up for. And so we maybe have a sense and an urge maybe to go off and think about things. And so I think that's the correct felt sense of like the bigger stuff you might want to do is you have a sense of like, I really feel like I need to go off for a day or a week or a month or a year to go think about things, and so Inqwire can work with that. And then basically the idea is that it gives a lot of structure. It'll keep you moving along. So you kind of, it's cognitive work, and then and you feel like you did your workout, and now there's time to rest. There's time you need to digest. Like if you think about what's really happening in your mind when you have an insight process, like your mind is invited to rewire itself radically, and you can just feel that. Like it gets like you want to nap, you want to just like rest. You just be like, whoa, I just need to let that seep in. And so having the spaciousness for that. Like it leaves me to craving a retreat-like setting because you don't want any input. It's like you want to let things gel, and you just want no input. You just want to let it gel. And I do want to say that like that also happens when you're doing it as a group. So when I know I've been saying that ordinary everyday use is what's bothering you, but in terms of what I want to point out is in terms of model revision, you can update a model because it's bothering you. You also just update models all the time, like we're doing right now, or updating each other's models. And so you can invite that updating, bringing people together. You also can bring people together around things that bothers everybody. And so the same inquiry process can be used with others so that they are all running the same, they're looking, they're, agreeing what the thing is, looking in the same direction, the same way, and then speaking to what they see. And now that blend of perspectives also becomes a fuel for insight that you also need to go and digest. Almost, to me, it feels like a sermon. Like you need to, it's almost like everyone it's very Quaker-like, but everyone feels like they're clean. It keeps it clean because it's asking question forms that aren't asking them to present their model, but to get deeper and present their experience. And so in that way, we also imagine that people could come together really easily using the tools without and be able to do things as groups without a lot of fuss.
Yeah. So, okay, that makes sense. And then another question is, and this brings back some of the things we were talking about earlier, where kind of people have different models and what do we do with that? as it
Right.
relates to clear seeing of reality. So like, let's say I wanted to focus on the question, death. Death is bothering me. I'm thinking about death, my own dissolution, all this sort of stuff. So I do this, and I have some insight, and my mind kind of reconfigures around all that. And now that's a very personal kind of experience that I've undergone. And if I were to now speak from my new perspective, I might say, yeah, I have some new clarity around this, and I could then translate all this felt sensibility of reality into words to try to now take my model and put it in someone else's, or my simulation, put someone else's simulation. I guess the question here is, if another person does that and they have a deeply felt experience and they come out of the woods and they're like, yeah, I just processed a lot of stuff around death. When we start sharing things about our simulations, are they just going to be like, oh yeah, they totally cohere? Or are they going to, is it very possible that they might be like, no, I came to a radically different conclusion? Do you know what I mean? So like, yeah.
Well, I think it depends how you come together, because again, if you come together, the models are reductive. Like, to communicate at the model level using model language, they're all reductive. You're leaving out the context if you're speaking in a certain way. So, but if you're communicating through this clean way, then people will reveal the basis of their whatever they're trying to communicate. Like the ideas that you would be able to express better anyway, a lot of context behind whatever you're asserting, not just the thing, which we all disagree on, but the context which you can't disagree on.
Yeah.
So it's like you have to you need to query the context, basically.
Yeah, no. So let me, I'll try to put a little bit even more context into this too. So see if we can figure this out. But like, let's say, let's just say you put the two people in this scenario, one's a Buddhist and one's a Christian. So there's a kind of background context about the Christian believes in heaven, let's say, and the Buddhist believes, in sort of escaping samsara or some kind of nirvana, state. And so maybe they're both kind of thinking about death, and they might have these beliefs, but they're sort of like, I don't know, this is kind of it bothers me. So they independently do their kind of Inqwire retreats, and they come to some personal insight. I guess where this question is getting at is it's about content as much as context. So it's sort of like, is there something like the Christian, will they go into their retreat and come out of it being like, oh, actually what I realized is that there isn't a heaven, there is just a state of pure blissful nothingness. And like the Buddhist will be like, oh, my notion of some like, will it bring people to some similar answer or something? Or is it that the contexts through the lenses through which they were already understanding these things might somehow be shifted and clarified in a way that works for them better or something?
Well, I think that probably people can appreciate how many layers there are to unravel in these kind of inquiries. Like, yes, exactly. You're going to be limited by your model, and you're going to bring your all that's required for sense making and for feeling. Like, all that your mind's going to want to do is go so far as it can navigate the world. So if it says, okay, after death, Santa Claus takes me to present heaven, and if I'm a good person, but I haven't been a good person, something often that bothers me, I haven't been a good person, and I kind of come to some insight that says, well, have you really though? And I think you've been a good enough person for Santa. And then be like, okay, I feel better now. And that's as far as you're going to get. Then some other jerk's going to come along and say, look, there's the North Pole. What do you see? And like, I don't see Santa. Do you see Santa? Like, you're such an asshole.
And then that would bother them.
Go off and figure something else out.
Right. Okay, interesting. So because I think that I don't this how do I say this? This might sound like it's a detraction or something, like it's a just, but I don't mean it that way. But it sounds like this is primarily therapeutic in that sense. But would you agree or disagree with framing it that way? Like, because if you think about therapy, like someone going to therapy isn't necessarily looking to find out some metaphysical or ontological reality, right? They're looking to kind of solve a personal problem. And so long as they do that in a way that is ultimately healthy for them, they've sort of done what therapy is supposed to do for them. That's a different thing than if they were to show up to like a PhD philosophy program or something and like have to interrogate their ideas in a certain way and all this stuff. So in terms of like getting at clear-sighted about reality, it seems that this is a being clear-sighted about reality more from a therapeutic lens than from sort of like an ontological lens. But would you agree or disagree or problematize me framing it that way somehow?
No, I love how you're coming at this. It's great. So I'd say that if it's bothering you that you don't know the truth of your existence, then that becomes your therapy. Like that's the merging. That if you're not satisfied, so I feel like at every level, if you're trying to answer questions about you, you're eventually going to ground it into your direct experience. And when you do that, you can't separate that from the feels.
Interesting.
And so then it gets associated with the therapy, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's like kind of, are you getting the feels or not? Like if you're doing a PhD program, you're not supposed to have the feels, but we kind of know you are. Like I studied climate science, and it's funny. I can have, as you probably can imagine, I have a reputation of being quite analytic, but I'm also very expressive in different contexts. So I was with some theater performing friends, and yeah, we were just riffing, and I just found myself improvising the role in opera of like a climate scientist, and I just broke down because of this idea that I wasn't allowed to express that pain that we all know. Like we cried daily in that program, learning about really getting a deep understanding of the planet and the disconnect between how people understand the threats and how we understand the threats, and how we don't have a voice and how hopeless it was. Just wanted to scream and bellow and wail, and yet I'm also being an atmospheric scientist. So, we're not supposed to have the feels. So that's a whole nother topic about like, you sign up for a PhD, and I don't know what it's like if you do theology. Like that seems kind of wild, actually.
Well, there's a lot of fields for the theologians for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, okay, so that's helpful. And I there's more I'd potentially like to dig in there, but for time's sake, I'd like to hear one. I mean, anywhere else you feel like from where we're at you'd like to go, but also you've mentioned maybe wanting to talk a little bit about kind of where this comes from, how this kind of science or the art of this was lost. And so I don't know.
I thought that'd be fun. How much longer do you want to talk? Yeah, how much time do you have?
I usually think about an hour and a half would be sort of about what people, kind of start to lose their focus after that. So that, maybe another 10, 15 minutes if you feel like that's enough time to get into some of that, or we could,
we can always pick up more later. Yeah, this is good. I feel like this is pretty good. We touched on a lot of good, I think that was great where you took it. I think, you can go to the site and just fill up more and more and more. That's obvious. We don't have on the site a academic paper draft. So if people are interested in that, they can find me, direct message me and ask for that. It just needs more work, but it goes into a lot more of the concrete nitty gritty. It's fully referenced, and we kind of left that out a lot of the arguments because I really get nerdy if I'm allowed to start referencing people and talk about their work. It just slows way down. So yeah, people want to know more, but we are very excited right now. Like I said, we just feel like we're in a position to come out and hopefully get people excited about this idea of doing a community practice. And I guess it'd be fun to talk about the art of truth historically, but probably the important thing to maybe touch on that we can unpack more later is this idea of, yes, that was yes, from a direct perspective, that felt like therapy. And yes, if you ask yourself things that are deeper that bother you, it feels like therapy. And at the same time, we're saying that this should be the framework for solving the human coordination problem, because we need to come into a sense of shared agreement. And we pointed out the fact that there'll be layers to that, but it may not matter if you bring the Christian together with the Buddhist, because the actual thing that may be intellectual. And at the end of the day, what do we need to coordinate around? It may not matter. Like, it may not matter that our beliefs don't agree. Beliefs only one dimension of the model. That's just hypotheses. And me and my co-founder have lots of hypotheses. And we know we can hold the fact that we have different hypotheses of how going to market will look like and how this will go and how that'll go. We don't have to it's almost a waste of time to try to agree on beliefs, because they're ephemeral and they change. They're just kind of our best map forward. There's so many other things that we need to align around, like values and trust, and for us to coordinate together, those other dimensions are really going to matter. So that can be fun, but I think when you start working with it, it's the headache realm. As I get older, I kind of don't like spending as much time in the headache realm. The other stuff's like but the belief layers, is hard. But you don't need it for the coordinating. What coordinating looks like is, let me paint an example. Like I've been trying to do natural coordination with builders up in the burn area of Northern California, and trying to put together various things. Like we've got millers, we have people that know how to get wood out of the forest. We know builders. We've got the permitting department, what they care about. We've got grant writers and CAL FIRE trying to figure out what fire cares about. We have the science. We have how are we going to pay for this? What do people want to do? What are they willing to do? What can they do? What do they need to do? Do we all get along? And all these dimensions are what are having to blend for us to start to solve real problems. Because right now, like we have disaster zones across California, and like they aren't getting rebuilt. And it seems like it's a perfect opportunity for having to bring in the real world constraints of the people around you dynamically anchored in what's their actual tacit knowledge. Like, so, you may say, well, like, as a baker, that may not be that valuable in this world, but in a new world, that's tacit knowledge that could be really helpful. Like as a short order cook might even be more helpful. Like I'm not at all intimidated to feed 100 people on time in 20 minutes, like how to coordinate a kitchen to like get people ready, like if they're fighting a fire, I could be the food person, So, but not relevant right now. I'm Inqwire person, but it's in my tacit knowledge history. So like, what are we bringing to something? So it's like kind of getting beyond, it's not LinkedIn, it's tacit knowledge that we're coordinating around. And do I feel the connection with the people around me? Do I get them? Do we all see the same thing? Do we all see the same landscape? So that sharing of seeing, and that sharing that is about doing the collective processes in a grounded way of like, what do you see? What do you see? Let me see through your eyes. And that kind of conversing. So it's like, it really is bringing back, I think, what we used to know how to do, which is like wisdom, around the campfire, sharing the understanding and coordinating around this. And so in that sense, it doesn't really feel like therapy, although I think this is what's hard for people to get, that it's both. It's hard for people to get that it's going to also have logic, like it's constraints. The constraints come in and they're going to make sense logically too. But it comes out of the reality of it.
And it seems as though, as you say, like the beliefs, the kind of propositional knowledge element of this is sort of only a small part, so that people could have, convergence around the more embodied element of this, and sort of a shared vision, shared goals, shared things like that. I mean, one of the things that
know how to coordinate. Yeah.
And one of the things that comes up for me though is the potential challenges, right? Like, let's say you've got a Christian and a Buddhist, let's just say, or any kind of group that maybe thinks of the other as an other, right? So it's sort of like, well, they think differently than us, they believe differently from us, so I can't connect with them, at some deep level or something. It seems like those sorts of dynamics might pose a challenge, but maybe this is precisely the sort of thing that could kind of break through some of those barriers.
It's not even a breakthrough, because those challenges only exist in one frame. There's so many more frames. There's about 1,000 frames of Inqwire collectively. That's how many frames there are of ways of looking.
Yeah.
There's only one way of looking where you might disagree, and then there's all these other ways of looking. Do you have kids? Are you going to die? Do you eat every day? Do you sleep? I mean, there's so many dimensions. Like, okay.
Yeah.
Like if that frame is not relevant, because most of those frames where we disagree, the tribalism has been manufactured. As we know, we've been manufactured to be tribal against each other as a way of controlling us, is to keep us opposing each other. So a lot, once we start deconstructing a lot of the analytic framework, the models we're trapped in which we haven't touched on at all, that if everyone's incentivized, the way we present the argument on the site is that you've got a root vulnerability, that people are incentivized to trap your attention in ungroundable models. An ungroundable model is to define a person as an other, to say that you are defined by the category I gave you. That's ridiculous. Like, and if you stop there, your tribalism blocks grounding to know a person in a complete way, in a whole way. It's a complete confabulation that a person can be defined by one dimension.
Well, that actually also, so I was going to ask, is it models inherently that are sort of just limited and problematic, or is it ungrounded models?
Ungrounded, right.
Okay, yeah, because the question that came up for me was sort of that one a plucky response, might be like, well, isn't this just another model, so to speak? Right?
Yeah, you can't skip the models.
Yeah, but
oh, you can. I mean, you can't. I mean, as you know, like when you nothing bothers you and your model's working, you have the sense of having escaped the model because there's nothing there. You just have you're in the model's so deep at such a deep level that you can't even notice it anymore. It becomes the water you swim in, like our visual field. It's really hard to see that visually there's a model. You have to do all these tricks to detect that you're doing a model. Like and some, I mean, I know there's some beyond, I think I could do waking, but I'll do lucid dreams where I can slow down my perceptual machinery and start to see what's underneath it. My God, I mean, but what an enterprise to try to see the model underneath the model. Yeah.
Well, here's a potential, not curveball, maybe a bit of a can of worms that we don't have time for. But I know that a lot of the times in our kind of group conversation, you'll want to problematize developmental models.
Oh yeah.
And I wonder if you could speak to that briefly about like what is it? Is it because of the frameworks that you're talking about here and the problems with models generally? Do you find developmental frameworks to be ungrounded models, or how would you? Yeah.
Oh, I'd say that basically it's like cutting at the kinds, and in physics we call it separable. Where's the problem naturally separable? Computer science too. Where does it separate? What's the natural kind to separate the problem? And I think this is all, again, I should have done this earlier on. E. McGilchrist is such a beautiful, like I came to that later. There's lots of people that present this argument. Like he points out too, everybody recognizes this, but he has the most thorough, complete, demonstration of what everyone's been pointing out is that when you have focused attention, analytic intelligence, left hemisphere capture, there's a quality to it. There's all these qualities to it. And then you can just look at like everything that's downstream of that. So I think that we'd say like basically, so what would be the developmental model that attaches to this, or is kind of one lurking, which is that if you want to try to close the vulnerability, you need to have certain metacognitive skills, and then you can get more and more skillful at that, of being able to like protect yourself against attention capture, not doing it to yourself, and essentially and skills for deconstructing and regrounding models. So we basically say like when things aren't bothering you, that you've arrived. That's it. You don't get I mean, if you want to say like, as we know, you can have things not bother you, and then all of a sudden the next thing that bothers you is like, you're going to die, like you kind of sign up for the insight process, whether you like it or not. And so, if you can really get to where nothing bothers you in the deepest way, that should converge with like, okay, you're okay with the dying thing. You're okay with the innocents being harmed. You're okay with the injustice. You're okay with the end of humanity, and you're okay with Donald Trump. That's always been my since I was 18, I'm like, Donald Trump, are you okay with Donald Trump? Like I just kind of,
it goes all the way back.
This guy.
Interesting. Yeah. Okay. So, and just to so with the developmental models specifically, it's sort of like you don't feel like that, whatever you want to call it, classification system, typology, modeling, framework kind of effectively is separable, or like effectively is like naming kinds. It's sort of an artificial imposition onto reality in a kind of.
Yeah, it's really easy to project. So let's just leave it at that. Like there's they're models of the development. And I guess I'm saying this feels like a little bit more of a meta model, which is basically like our end state is living and being connected to reality, and with what being able to feel as though you're thriving and you have good life outlook and things make sense to you.
Mm-hmm.
Like that's it's very simple.
Mm-hmm.
Very simple.
Yeah. I wonder if there's a degree to which when you're asking questions at such a high level that it's sort of like there can be dissonance between scales of questioning, right? So it's like someone could be like, hey, what's for dinner tonight? And then someone could be like, how could you be asking that? Don't you know the world is, on fire? And it's sort of like, well, but they're both valid questions in their scale, right? So it's sort of like maybe, and so the reason why I put it that way is like, I wonder, is it, there's a place for models maybe, but maybe there's a place for meta models. And then if people are trying to have different scale level conversations, there can be a dissonance or something.
Well, I think that's really good. You brought me to the kind of a better version of my argument, which I I guess I'm getting a little tired too. So, but you brought me back. It's great. So, so what I'd say is that most of the developmental models kind of assume, let's say, an average life where a person as a child are kind of sheltered from existential givens and whatnot. And then as they're ready, they peer deeper and deeper into these like higher meta layers, and there's kind of this like expanding bigger thing. And what I have argued on the thread is that unless you've tested that, unless you've tested that you take an infant at the meta level, that you can't do that. Like if you get an infant to think at that level, why would you? But could you? And then they're already at this level, but they haven't even figured out like how like to tie their shoes. And then that would be like a counterexample. And then I kind of offered up, I think I might as well say it now, I guess. So, I'm kind of out in the world. I was kind of raised as a science experiment, and my dad like sat me down like when I was an infant and explained all the existential givens to me. And so I remember like my early dreams, I'm still crawling and I'm imagining being suspended in a treadmill in space. And then knowing that as soon as my body gives up, I'm gonna go backwards and fall back into the void. And that there's all these stuffed animals on either side trying to distract me from that truth. And I'm like, what is this? Like, what is this setup? Like, there's an arrow of time I'm stuck on for 100 years, and I'm going to fall back into wherever I came from. And I don't even know why anybody's talking about anything. And so I would retire to my room every evening and have a little glass of milk and play this music box. And I would listen to the music box unwind, look at the stars. And this is before preschool or anything. And I would imagine the last note was my last breath, and then try to imagine into what was going to come after and what life had I looked back on. And I did this constantly. And so I felt as though I was kind of a weird kid, but I was coming at this really, that was problematic, right? It was problematic because the absurdities, I was laughing at everybody. I was really kind of a misanthrope. I had to learn how to like re-embed, because I was like, why is anyone so concerned with this? Like, we're going to die. So I don't recommend it. I think, it's novel, but I think it's great to just kind of give kids the things in the other order. But I had this direct experience of saying, well, I kind of leapfrog to this really, and I could go really deep into these imaginings. And I feel like actually the quality of my imaginings never were as good as they were when I was an infant. Like I was really clean in terms of like trying to look, and I felt like I could see the 3D-ness of the stars back then and imagine infinity and imagine like time in a way that I don't feel that clear and clean anymore.
Very fascinating. That's certainly a very unique experience. I mean, there's all sorts of instances that you could point to. I mean, I have my own, but like versions where things come online for you sort of developmentally, either out of sequence or in some ways just, right. I mean, out of sequence according to the model, right?
Right.
And the ways that I guess impacts things down the road. And also anyway, there's a lot that's fascinating, and thanks for sharing that, though. That's also just really interesting context personally. So that's really
kind of weird thing to wrestle with.
Well, on that really cosmic note of a treadmill in space surrounded by stuffed animals, that sounds. We'll end on that transcendent note. But this has been really helpful for me and really fascinating. I think this project is just so cool. I think I have a better grasp on it, though. I can also tell that there's like a lot more to cover too. So I definitely foresee maybe getting into the other elements of this, and maybe even like some kind of a demonstration, and I don't know, a lot more to come from all this. But Jill Nephew, thank you so much. I really appreciate you coming on, and this has been great.
I really enjoyed it. Thank you, Brendan.